heard from Harold Holzer and some great discussion with the audience following. And we do expect there to be some ebb and flow to the day as people's schedules allow. And we hope others will join us even further on in the afternoon. My name is Philip Kuhnhard. I'm a Bard Center Fellow. I'm also the director of this conference, and I will be moderating our discussion following our address. Sitting on the panel, along with our keynote speaker, are two highly esteemed Bard professors, Mark Lytle and Jeffrey Sanborn, coming to us from the history and literature faculties. And I want to thank them both for being here for this session. Each of them will give a brief response following the next keynote speaker. That speaker, about to be introduced, is Douglas Wilson, one of the most eminent Lincoln scholars in the country. He is a Galesburg, Illinois. Douglas debates, and you might want to ask, he is one of the founders of the partner Rodney O. Davis of several, including an extraordinary book that I have found immensely helpful in my own work, a book titled Lincoln's Informants. His center worked closely with the Library of Congress to produce an annotated online edition of the Lincoln Papers, and he is the author of two essential books on Lincoln, each of which won the Lincoln Prize, not a Lincoln Prize. Honor's Voice in 1999, and Lincoln's Sword in 2007. You know the expression, the sword. The pen is mightier than the sword. Lincoln's sword was his pen. Today, Professor Wilson will speak to us about Lincoln and language, tracing the evolution of Lincoln as a writer. And I see Mark looking over at me with a smile. I believe it was Mark who first suggested this topic as being part of this conference, and I want to thank him for that. I do believe that Lincoln's use of language, both written and spoken, was one of the great secrets of his success as a leader. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Douglas Wilson to our college.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I spent my whole career at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, as Philip just said, and it's a great pleasure always for me to visit one of the really distinguished liberal arts colleges like Bard, which I've never been before. It's a great pleasure to be here. When Abraham Lincoln became president, he was already a writer of great ability, but as far as the American public was concerned, this was a distinctly hidden asset. While he had earned high marks as a political speaker on the stump, as well as on more formal occasions, Lincoln had no reputation as a writer with the public at large, or even among his closest friends. At the time of his election, an editorial voiced the reservations of many in Lincoln's own party when it asked, "Who will write this ignorant man's state papers?" But as we know, his presidential papers subsequently came to be understood as literary productions, such that he would eventually acquire standing as a writer, and in the fullness of time, a great writer. I've argued that insofar as we judge the stature of American writers by the such things as familiarity of the public with their words, or by the importance of their writings as expressions of the national purpose, Abraham Lincoln is simply unsurpassed, and possibly in a class all by himself. What the American public had no way of knowing in 1861 was the singular fact that Abraham Lincoln, though almost totally bereft of formal education, had been a keen student of language from his childhood. The testimony of his family and his neighbors in Indiana, where he grew up, leaves no doubt that as a boy he was more than merely interested in words and meanings, he was obsessed by them. The evidence bearing on his intellectual development in his formative years, particularly the testimony of his stepmother, suggests that what was even more important than his legendary fireside reading was his early dedication to writing. Once we are attuned to it, the lore about Lincoln turns out to be replete with stories and examples of his long-standing preoccupation with words, his sensitivity to the diversity of their meanings, and his delight in wordplay. The very first page of Michael Burlingame's new biography reports an indicative remark Lincoln made when asked about his family's lineage. He said that he understood the first American Lincolns had, quote, settled in a small Massachusetts place called Hingham, or perhaps it was Hangham. To read through Lincoln's writings is to uncover a persistent fascination with verbal equivocation, both as an observer and a practitioner. He was, after all, a lawyer, and legal arguments often come down to the meanings of words, or the manipulation or evasion thereof. One of the stories of his early days at the bar is ostensibly about some young men Lincoln was asked to defend in frontier Menard County who had been arrested for playing cards. In my reading of it, the story is more about the clueless prosecutor who knew nothing about card games. But since there were allegedly two different games involved, he thought he could show these rude miscreants how the prosecutorial game was played. To assure that they felt the full force of the enormity of their crime, he brought one indictment against them for playing a game identified as 7-Up, and a second indictment for playing the one designated as Old Sledge. 2 games, 2 indictments. But for all he knew about the law, there was something he didn't know that everyone else in the courtroom did. That these were 2 different names for the same game. So when the first charge was brought, the sympathetic witnesses solemnly testified that the defendants, accused of playing 7-Up, were playing Old Sledge, with the result that all were acquitted. For the officious prosecutor, this must have been bad enough, but imagine his chagrin and the crowd's delight when the second charge was brought and all the witnesses testified that those accused of playing Old Sledge were actually playing 7-Up. This is admittedly equivocation at a primitive level, but Lincoln's experience with it covered a wide range. It's arguably one of the reasons he favored Macbeth over other Shakespearean plays, for as Gary Wills has shown in his book, Witches and Jesuits, equivocation is a deeply embedded theme of that play. The issue of equivocation, in fact, entered Lincoln's most anguished meditations, such as those that underlay his long struggle as president to fathom the direction and purpose of divine providence in the course of a horrendous civil war. With these matters very much in mind, in the autumn of 1864, he told a visitor when he called that he, the president, had been, quote, deep in Pope. And he quoted from memory the famous passage from Alexander Pope's Essay on Man that concludes with the lines, "And spite of pride in reason's spite, one truth is clear, whatever is right." When his visitor remarked on the beauty of this passage, Lincoln reportedly said, "Yes, that's a convenient line, too, that last one. You see, a man may turn it and say, well, if whatever is right, why then, whatever isn't must be wrong." One of the very few public speeches that Lincoln gave, and one that deserves to be better known, was delivered at the Baltimore Sanitary Fair in April of 1864, and it contains a notable example of Lincoln using the same issue of verbal equivocation for a serious political purpose. Here the subject is something he cared deeply about and that was somehow at the center of the national crisis, the concept of liberty. The world, he says, has never had a good definition of the word liberty, and the American people just now are much in want of one. We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others, the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labors. Here are two not only different but incompatible things called by the same name, liberty. And it follows that each of the things is, by the respective parties, called by two different and incompatible names, liberty and tyranny. As a boy, Lincoln read every book he could lay his hands on, which resulted in a motley collection of literary models, but one book that had an undoubted and enduring impact was Aesop's Fables, as is evident in the passage that follows the one I just read. The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as a liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as the destroyer of liberty, especially as the sheep is a black one. Plainly, the sheep and the wolf are not agreed on a definition of the word liberty, and precisely the same difference prevails today among us human creatures, even in the North, and all professing to love liberty. Hence we behold the process by which thousands are daily passing from under the yoke of bondage, hailed by some as the advance of liberty, and bewailed by others as the destruction of all liberty. There are a number of reasons why Lincoln had chosen to speak in Baltimore, but the most important one was surely to call attention to the dramatic turnaround that Baltimore and the state of Maryland represented. At the outset of the Civil War, there had been powerful forces at work in Maryland, and especially in Baltimore, first to oppose Lincoln's inauguration, and later, after the firing on Fort Sumter, to impede his efforts to defend the capital, to say nothing of the attempts by these same forces to bring about Maryland's secession from the Union. Now, 3 years later, the state of Maryland was preparing to do something quite astonishing and monumental. It was about to abolish slavery. This is what Lincoln refers to in the sentence that follows his Aesopian fable on liberty. Recently, he says, as it seems, the people of Maryland have been doing something to define liberty. And thanks to them, that in what they've done, the Wolf's Dictionary has been repudiated. There's a world of meaning packed into Lincoln's provocative metaphor, the Wolf's Dictionary. But it will suffice for our purposes here simply to point out that Lincoln's way of exploiting the opportunity presented by Maryland's forthcoming Emancipation Act was to focus on the importance of words. What he said at Baltimore in 1864 is reminiscent of something he'd said in one of many manuscript fragments that survived from the 1850s. Employing a familiar biblical allusion to a line from Proverbs, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in pictures of silver. Lincoln produced what is arguably his most effective illustration of the primacy of the Declaration of Independence in American polity. Important as the Constitution and the Union are to Americans, he argued, they are, quote, not the primary cause of our great prosperity. There is something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all. The Declaration's assertion of that principle at that time was the word fitly spoken, which has proved an apple of gold to us. The Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver, subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. Another of Lincoln's speeches that deserves to be better known is his address to the Wisconsin Agricultural Fair, delivered in Milwaukee in September of 1859. While not a political speech, it has, as John Channing Briggs has noted, a definite political edge. And this is evident in the way Lincoln opens the address. Having been preoccupied for all of 5 years in helping to create a new political party, a fusion party, as it was called, composed of former political adversaries, it's no accident that Lincoln began his address by emphasizing the good that agricultural fairs do by bringing people together. This was the burden of the first sentence. But the second sentence, he brings his notion alive by an appeal to specific words. From the first appearance of man upon the earth down to very recent times, the words stranger and enemy were quite, or almost, synonymous. Long after civilized nations had defined robbery and murder as high crimes and had affixed severe punishments to them, when practiced among and upon their own people, respectively, it was deemed no offense, but even meritorious, to rob and murder and enslave strangers, whether as nations or as individuals. Even yet, this has not totally disappeared. Starting out with what looks like a commonplace, fairs bring people together, Lincoln's appeal to the words stranger and enemy galvanizes our attention, and by the third sentence we're swept into the history of civilization, literally the civilizing of society, a process that, by Lincoln's telling, was still incomplete. Along the way, the issue of enslavement has been quietly inserted into the discussion as one of man's inhumanities to man that is, quote, not totally disappeared. This is part of the political edge we spoke of earlier, but it's most pronounced in connection with the discussion of labor, where Lincoln tackles a particular rationalization of slavery then being touted as the mudsill theory. The mudsill theory, first expounded by a U.S. senator from South Carolina in 1858, held that, quote, in all social systems there must be a class to do menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. And without such a class, you would not have that other class which leads progress, civilization, and refinement. The South, James Henry Handom proclaimed on the floor of the Senate, has fortunately found a race adapted to that purpose and called them slaves. The North, he said, also has a mudsill class, and while it deigned not to use the word, Hammond says, quote, the whole hireling class of manual laborers are essentially slaves. A dispute about free labor and the meaning of the word slave was tailor-made for a person with Lincoln's political and linguistic interests. The chief obstacle a modern reader has with this passage is the unfamiliarity of the word mudsill, on which everything turns. As almost everyone in Lincoln's audience in 1859 would have known, this word refers to the lowest structural part of a building, whether board or stone or block. The bottommost member was called a mudsill, and it was the kind of word that Lincoln relished because its metaphorical potential with its invidious connotations for human beings played right into his hands. According to that theory, Lincoln says, the education of laborers is not only useless, but pernicious and dangerous. In fact, it is in some sort deemed a misfortune that laborers should have heads at all. Those same heads are regarded as explosive material, only to be safely kept in damp places, as far as possible from the peculiar sort of fire which ignites them. A Yankee who could invent a strong-handed man without a head would receive the everlasting gratitude of the mudsill advocates. Here Lincoln zeroes in on something that's completely ignored or overlooked by the mudsills, namely the intellectual potential of the hireling class. This is, of course, the main point of the passage, and its effectiveness as an argument is much enhanced by his audience's instinctive identification with mudsill laborers and Lincoln's depiction of them as having heads as well as hands. But we should also note the way Lincoln's argument is quickened by the striking phrase he uses to characterize the minds of the mudsill laborers, explosive materials. For Lincoln's audience, and especially as it applied to mudsills he was talking about, this was more than a little audacious, and as such it represents a characteristic Lincolnian touch, his constant affinity for unexpected and quietly electrifying language. Here and elsewhere, Lincoln promoted free labor by pointing out the prime difference between a slave and a free laborer, which is that the free laborer is free to move, to improve his skills, to acquire education, in short, to better his condition. As arguments justifying slavery had intensified and become more public in the 1850s, Lincoln had been talking increasingly about the interrelationship, or perhaps we should say the interdependence, of democracy and freedom, especially emphasizing free labor and the liberating force of initiative, education, and self-improvement. In these writings and speeches, he developed a model for the kind of fulfillment that approximates what is now called the American dream, something he repeatedly used as an answer to the mudsill theory. But he never expressed it more compactly than in a single sentence in the Milwaukee Address. This is it. The prudent, penniless beginner in the world labors for wages a while, saves a surplus with which to buy tools or land for himself, then labors on his own account another while, and at length hires another new beginner to help him. It wasn't quite his own success story, though he often pointed out in his speeches that he himself had started out as a penniless laborer. But it was a pattern of success that was very familiar to his audience. We are indebted to Lincoln's stepmother, Sarah Bush Lincoln, who revealed the salient fact that even as a boy, Lincoln had a passion for clarity of expression. Sometimes, she said, he seemed pestered to give expression to his ideas and got mad almost at one who couldn't explain plainly what he wanted to convey. Observe, if you will, that this statement is in two parts. She tells us first that the boy was pestered to find the right words for his own ideas, but also he was impatient with people who had the same problem. Directly confirming this recollection is something that Lincoln in 1860 told the Reverend John P. Gulliver, who had complimented him on the clarity of his statements. Lincoln replied by telling Gulliver that, quote, "Among my earliest recollections, I remember how, when a mere child, I used to get irritated when anybody talked to me in a way that I could not understand." For his part, Lincoln said he himself was never satisfied until I could put it in language plain enough, as I thought, for any boy I knew to comprehend. Just as his stepmother had suggested, what Lincoln told Gulliver connected his obsession with clarity to his writing, which he says he actively employed as an aid to understanding. Lincoln's continued pursuit of clarity in later life was not lost on those associated with him. His longtime friend in politics and at the bar, Judge Joseph Gillespie, is a good example. Quote, "If Mr. Lincoln studied one thing, any one thing, more than another, and for effect," he wrote, "it was to make himself understood by all classes. He had great natural clearness and simplicity of statement, and this faculty he cultivated with marked assiduity." Gillespie's characterization is helpful in representing Lincoln's clarity as seemingly a natural attribute, yet one that he did not take for granted, but worked hard at. Lincoln's law partner, William H. Herndon, described the same phenomenon in a letter to his collaborator, emphasizing the assiduity. Lincoln always struggled to see the thing, this is Herndon, Lincoln always struggled to see the thing or the idea exactly and to express that idea in such language as to convey that idea precisely. He used to bore me terribly by his methods, processes, manners, and so forth. Lincoln would doubly explain things to me that needed no explanation. His ambition in this line was he wanted to be distinctly understood by the common people. As president, this changed very little. Harriet Beecher Stowe reported in 1864 that, quote, "Our own politicians were somewhat shocked with his state papers, and that attempts had been made to get Lincoln to let other, more experienced hands do this kind of writing for him." She reported that he stubbornly declined all efforts of assistance with his important papers, and he insisted on writing them himself. Stowe represented Lincoln as saying, "No, I shall write them myself. The people will understand them." Understanding was still the great test. It's useful, I believe, to see Lincoln's writing not only as the medium for expressing his political arguments and ideas, but as being directly related to the extraordinary literary ferment of the 1850s. Consider, for instance, this brief list of some of the works of that decade that would eventually be recognized as American classics of the first order. 1850, Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. 1851, Herman Melville's Moby Dick. 1854, Henry David Thoreau's Walden. 1855, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. 1858, Emily Dickinson's first hand-sewn fascicle of manuscript poems. Another work that seems, in my opinion, to be destined to be accorded comparable stature is Frederick Douglass's My Bondage and My Freedom, which was published in 1855. If we consider that this sudden eruption of literary landmarks, landmark literary work, marks a revolution in the nature and quality of American writing, it's hardly an accident that Abraham Lincoln, in enunciating a political and personal reawakening over the extension of slavery, suddenly found a powerful new voice in 1854 in what is known as his Peoria speech, arguably the greatest of his pre-presidential speeches. In this perspective, Lincoln's emergence in the 1850s, which is usually regarded in a purely political aspect, can be seen as part of the flowering of art and expression that F.O. Matheson famously called an American Renaissance. Seeing Lincoln's writing in this perspective helps us to account for the distinctive character of his prose. When it began to attract the attention during his presidency, the word that even sympathetic journalists commonly used to characterize it was peculiar, a word that was, in fact, used by Herndon himself. What they were referring to was essentially this: largely to achieve clarity of expression and to be widely understood, Lincoln had for 20 years been deliberately and quite self-consciously perfecting a discourse of plain language. The result was far more evident in his own day than it is in ours, for he lived in an era in which elevated and self-consciously literary diction was the acknowledged mark of learning and refinement, when those were almost synonymous with respectable discourse, written or spoken. But Lincoln's well-attested passion for clarity and for making his ideas and arguments understood by ordinary citizens implied, if not dictated, a plainness in diction. By his own rule, to use expressions and words that your audience was not familiar with made little sense. True, it was always possible to charm and beguile an audience by talking over their heads. Ralph Waldo Emerson was notorious for making his living this way. But if you wanted to change the minds of farmers and storekeepers and ordinary folks and persuade them to accept new ideas and positions, Lincoln's theory was that you must speak their language. His law partner Herndon, who was also a frequent public speaker, reported that Lincoln often counseled him not to shoot too high, shoot low down, and the common people will understand you. The educated ones will understand you anyhow. The first Lincoln speech, for which we have a complete text, his Lyceum address, January 1838, which was discussed this morning, is written in language that was fairly conventional. Lincoln is not yet 30 years old. Written in language that was fairly conventional for the oratory of that day, but much of it sounds decidedly un-Lincolnian. Take, for example, what is perhaps the best-known sentence Abraham Lincoln ever wrote, the opening of the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's Lincolnian. Compare this with a statement in the Lyceum Address that expresses very nearly the same idea. Speaking of the founders, he says, "Theirs was the task, and nobly they performed it, to possess themselves, and through themselves us, of this goodly land, and to uprear upon its hills and its valleys a political edifice of liberty and equal rights." If this sounds closer to Senator Claghorn than Abraham Lincoln, there are reasons for it, but I would like to call attention here. What I'd like to call attention to is that not long after he delivered this speech, the manner and diction of Lincoln's written speeches began to change. This was, for example, the last edifice he would ever uprear. For these two words, along with a great many others from the Lyceum speech, thereafter simply disappear from his written vocabulary. A wonderfully useful feature of the online version of Lincoln's collected works, called Word Index, has greatly enhanced the study of Lincoln's vocabulary by making it possible to identify and track every word Lincoln employed in his writing. Using the 1838 Lyceum Address as a baseline, we can readily see that words such as salubrity, unprofaned, bane, prattle, just to give a sampling, are, like uprear, effectively banished from his written vocabulary and never used again. Certain familiar expressions share the same fate: lisping babes, towering genius, monuments of fame. Which reminds us that long before Strunk and Wright, discerning writers recognized that overused expressions should be avoided. Lincoln's vocabulary, especially when he was young, was built up from his reading, and it's sometimes possible to be reasonably certain where he got his expressions. In the 1834 announcement of his candidacy for the legislature, his first time he ran, his use of the compound word heart appalling, he was talking about the cost of railroads, heart appalling, almost certainly comes from his reading of the preface of a book he listed as part of his early reading, James Riley's Narrative. Not only did he not repeat the unusual word heart appalling, he thereafter never even used the more ordinary expression appalling. These verbal disappearances serve as indications that diction, that is, the choice and use of words and phrases in speech or writing, involves the avoidance of words and phrases, as well as the acquisition and employment of new ones. In gradually working towards a discourse of plain language, Lincoln was simplifying and rearranging his working vocabulary by actively shedding some of the words that had attracted him earlier in his career. Take the word uprear, which appears in the Lyceum Address and nowhere else. It's not hard to fathom where he got such a word, as it is often used by the English poets he was reading and reciting so assiduously at this time of life. One of these poems was Lord Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, in which Byron more than once uses upreared in precisely the same context, such as the passage describing a fit unwalled temple upreared of human hands. Lincoln would also have found the word in the works of his favorite author, William Shakespeare, for example in Sonnet 49, or in the prologue to Henry V, the famous Muse of Fire speech, which Lincoln likely knew by heart. Here's the passage. Suppose within the girdle of these walls are now confined two mighty monarchies, whose high upreared and abutting fronts the perilous narrow ocean parts asunder. I quote this mainly to show the Shakespearean vocabulary to which the word uprear belongs, and much as Lincoln loved it and would continue to love it, how inappropriate it would be to the plain discourse that he was developing in which to reach and persuade his Illinois audience. This is at least part of the answer to the question so often asked, if Lincoln was such a keen student of Shakespeare all of his life, where can we see the evidence of it in his writing? The answer suggested here is not in his diction and vocabulary. While he knew and loved Shakespearean language, the discipline of plain discourse ruled it out. He did not, of course, reform his diction overnight, but the next speech after the Lyceum Address, of which we have a complete text, his sub-treasury speech, nearly 2 years later, is notable for the comparative absence of the 25-cent words that decorate the Lyceum Address. Part of the difference may reflect the pressure he was under, having disappointed his Whig friends with a lackluster performance in an earlier appearance. In bearing down to redeem himself, he focused intently on marshaling arguments in direct, forceful language such as this. By the sub-treasury, the revenue is to be collected and kept in iron boxes until the government wants it for disbursement, thus robbing the people of the use of it, while the government does not itself need it, and while the money is performing no nobler office than that of rusting in iron boxes. The natural effect of this change of policy, everyone will see, is to reduce the quantity of money in circulation. If you know anything about those antebellum frontier times, you know that money was almost impossible to come by, and most business was done by barter. One can hear at least a hint of Lincoln's mature prose in that. By the time he came to the presidency, his prose was mature, but this was either not apparent or made little difference to those who didn't know much about him, particularly the large number who were suspicious of his presidential qualifications. For someone like the ex-slave Frederick Douglass, another autodidact with a remarkable gift for expression, and one who was sharply critical of the government's policies, the president's plain style reflected his shortcomings. When in 1862 Lincoln met with black leaders to urge a scheme of colonization, Douglass was furious, especially since the president had appeared to put the blame for the Civil War on the blacks. In denouncing the meeting and the president in his magazine, Douglass struck out at Lincoln's language. We might also criticize the style adopted, so exceedingly plain and coarse-threaded as to make the impression that Mr. Lincoln had a low estimate of the intelligence of his audience, so as to think any but the simplest phrases and constructions would be above their power of comprehension. As Mr. Lincoln, however, in all his writings has manifested a decided awkwardness in the management of the English language, we do not think there is any intention in this respect, but only the incapacity to do better. But Douglass wrote this in anger, and before he had any personal acquaintance with Lincoln. After the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, followed by two memorable encounters in the president's office and a warm reception at the White House following the second inaugural, Douglass became an admirer, not just of Lincoln himself, but of his use of language. In my interviews with him, he wrote later, I found him, as I've already described him, a plain man. There was neither paint nor varnish about him. It's a wonder. That may have been a cliche in the 19th century. I've never run across it before, but it seems to me to be a wonderful collection of metaphors. There was neither paint nor varnish about him. His manners were simple, unaffected, unstudied. His language, like himself, was plain, strong, and sinewy, just as it appears in his written productions. He spoke as he wrote, without ornament. Earnest, but never extravagant, I never met a man who could state more clearly and forcibly just what he wished to make apparent. The plainness of Lincoln's mature prose style consisted of a great deal more than plain diction, a technique that surely owes something to his career. Frequently in his presidential writing is the practice of putting what are essentially declarative statements in the form of pointedly worded questions. In his message to Congress, July 4th, 1861, in which he laid out the basis on which the Civil War would be fought, Lincoln used this strategy to good effect. In defending his suspension of habeas corpus in Maryland, for example, where the troops coming to the defense of the government in Washington were being harassed and obstructed, he cut through the legal and constitutional entanglements by putting a question that was blazingly clear. To state the question more directly, are all the laws but one to go unexecuted and the government itself go to pieces lest that one be violated? Lincoln's reference to putting his question more directly spotlights another characteristic of his use of language that was certainly unexpected and probably considered in governmental prose distinctly odd: directness. Like a shrewd military commander, Lincoln knew the strategic value, under certain circumstances, of going straight at his opponent. When Horace Greeley attacked him publicly in his newspaper in 1862, demanding in a long, scolding harangue that he spell out his policy, Lincoln replied with something he'd already written that was breathtakingly direct: "I would save the Union." In another of his public letters, he began by directly confronting his critics. "There are those who are dissatisfied with me. To such I would say, you desire peace, and you blame me that we do not have it. But how can we attain it? There are but three conceivable ways. First, to suppress the rebellion by force of arms. This I am trying to do. Are you for it? If you are, so far we are agreed. If you are not for it, a second way is to give up the Union. I am against this." By seizing the initiative, he's here able to set the agenda and establish a tangible momentum. But the means of accomplishing his feat are directly related to the language employed, which we should note consists in this passage almost entirely of words of one syllable. Or consider the way he begins his only known law lecture. Incidentally, this manuscript is on display in the new exhibit, wonderful exhibit at the Library of Congress. Here's the way he begins his law lecture. "I am not an accomplished lawyer." This is equally direct but not confrontational. It is instead ingratiating by its unexpected candor. Manuscripts can sometimes be helpful in showing the writer actively engaged in rhetorical strategies, and I know of no better example than the manuscript of this lecture. Further on, Lincoln begins his third paragraph, "Never encourage litigation." What could be more direct and emphatic than this forceful three-word sentence? The manuscript shows Lincoln in the act of seeking an answer, for he struck out the words "never encourage" and created a two-word sentence that is even more direct and more emphatic: "discourage litigation." We've been speaking of clarity, plainness of diction, declarative interrogatories, directness, seizing the rhetorical initiative, and so forth. A comprehensive example encompassing all of these is found in Lincoln's response to his devious Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, who in September of 1863, this would be 9 months after the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, urged the President, for shamelessly expedient reasons, to rescind certain territorial exemptions specified in the Emancipation Proclamation. Whether Lincoln thought that Chase couldn't see that what he was urging was ill-advised, or whether he suspected that getting him to take such a false step was exactly what Chase had in mind, Lincoln wrote a quietly ripping refusal that covered both possibilities. "If I take the step, must I not do so without the argument of military necessity, and so without any argument except the one that I think the measure politically expedient and morally right? Would I not thus give up all footing upon Constitution and law? Would I not thus be in the boundless field of absolutism? Could this pass unnoticed or unresisted? Could it fail to be perceived without any further stretch that I might do the same in Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri? and even change any law in any state? Would not many of our friends shrink away appalled? It says appalled, but not appalling. Would it not lose us the elections, and with them, the very cause that we seek? The facility with which Lincoln finds and runs out fatal objections to Chase's plan seemingly leaves little choice between a judgment of either ineptitude or disloyalty. This may explain why this incisive letter is unsigned and possibly remained unsent. If Lincoln's foremost aim was indeed that of clarity being understood by a wide range of readers or auditors, he certainly did not intend thereby to sacrifice persuasiveness if he could help it. While he avoided the florid, ornamental language of conventional oratory, at the same time he was consciously cultivating a keen sense of cadence and developing a variety of rhythmic and rhetorical effects that, even though he was using ordinary language and diction, could result in a kind of prose poetry for which his best presidential writings are known. Here's a passage from an early speech on temperance, which deals with the prosaic subject of the merchandising of liquor. Wagons drew it from town to town, boats bore it from clime to clime, and the winds wafted it from nation to nation, and merchants bought it and sold it by wholesale, by retail, with precisely the same feelings on the part of the seller, buyer, and bystander as are felt at the selling and buying of flour, beef, bacon, or any other of the real necessities of life. There's nothing here to rival the Gettysburg Address or the Second Inaugural, but the cadenced cataloging, which lends interest to the presentation, may be seen as something of a harbinger of the later style. The Milwaukee Address, which was written 17 years later, in 1859, contains a more developed example of the same mode. And what is so noteworthy here is that the writer most likely to be brought to mind by this passage to a modern-day reader is Walt Whitman. This was mentioned earlier in the morning presentation, too. Less surprising, but perhaps more venturesome, is that Lincoln's subject before an audience of farmers is unabashedly intellectual, focusing on the way in which farming presents to the mind what he calls an exhaustless source of profitable enjoyment. Every blade of grass is a study, and to produce two where there was but one is both a profit and a pleasure. And not grass alone, but soil, seeds, and seasons, hedges, ditches, and fences, draining, droughts, and irrigations, plowing, hoeing, and harrowing, reaping, mowing, and threshing, saving crops, pests of crops, diseases of crops, and what will prevent or cure them, implements, utensils, and machines, their relative merits and how to improve them, hogs, horses, and cattle, sheep, goats, and poultry, trees, shrubs, fruits, plants, and flowers, the thousands of things of which these are specimens, each a world of study within itself. Like the one from the Temperance Address, this brief passage from the Milwaukee Address is not a full-fledged mode of expression, but more of an exercise, an etude of greater things to come. In his eulogy to his beau ideal of a statesman, Henry Clay, Lincoln wrote that Clay's eloquence did not result from the use of rhetorical devices, but rather from, quote, the impassioned tone that comes from deep conviction. The same might be said for Lincoln's eloquence, yet the devices are undoubtedly there. Nearly 100 years ago, Charles Smiley, an American professor of classics at Grinnell College, traveled to Berlin, then the Mecca of classical studies, to spend a winter immersed in ancient Greek texts. A true American, Professor Smiley deliberately carried with him the everyman selection of Lincoln's speeches and letters to serve, he says, as an antidote against Prussian bureaucracy. The everyman Lincoln was also expected to serve as an antidote to the object of his study, Leonard von Spengel's 3-volume edition of the ancient Greek rhetoricians. As Professor Smiley put it in unlincolnian diction, after a careful study of the flowers of speech in the ancient world, what could be more refreshing than a look into some old-fashioned garden, into some book unbedizened by any form of meretricious embellishment? What the professor found instead, when he turned from the ancient Greeks to the untutored American statesman, was that Lincoln's best writings exhibited clear-cut examples of the very rhetorical devices identified with Gorgias, a flamboyant rhetorician whose practice had been severely censured by Aristotle as exhibiting, quote, the marks of superficial sham and insincerity. And yet, Smiley discovered that the Gettysburg Address, for example, had, quote, 2 antitheses, 5 cases of anaphora, 8 instances of balanced phrases and clauses, and 13 alliterations. Lincoln's famous letter to Horace Greeley was even more Gorgian. In 44 lines, we have 6 completely balanced sentences, 8 cases of anaphora, 6 instances of similar clause endings, and 6 antitheses. Even the passage in praise of Helen, attributed to Gorgias, Professor Smiley says, is not so completely Gorgian in its embellishment. Professor Smiley's discovery spotlights something important about Lincoln's use of language and ultimately his eloquence. Though submerged and generally inconspicuous, the same rhetorical devices that have been suspect since ancient times as telltale signs of superficiality and insincerity are nonetheless part and parcel of many of Lincoln's most inspiring works. And being in his hands somehow unobtrusive, they've not only not stigmatized the writer, but in Professor Smiley's words, they had somehow proved themselves capable of sincerity. Professor Smiley's conclusion is reminiscent of that of Gillespie, Herndon, and others on the subject, but has never been better stated, and it's this: Lincoln cared more for his thought than for his style, but he cared so much for his thought that he studied with care the means of making it incisive and effective. I want to close these remarks on Lincoln's use of language by calling attention to the way he closes his Milwaukee address, which is with a story about the ideal sentence. This is another Aesopian fable, the story of an Eastern monarch who charges his wise men to invent a sentence, quote, which should be true and appropriate in all times and situations. They presented him with the words, "And this too shall pass away." Lincoln grants that this ultimate sentence is wonderfully expressive, so chastening, he says, in the hour of pride, and consoling in the depths of affliction. Yet, he says, shifting into a mode so much admired and emulated by President Obama, let us hope that it's not quite true. Let us hope, rather, that by the best cultivation of the physical world beneath and around us, and the intellectual and moral world within us, we shall secure an individual, social, and political prosperity and happiness whose course shall be onward and upward, and which, while the earth endures, shall not pass away. Thanks very much.
Wasn't that wonderful? We are going to have now a chance for 2 brief responses to the keynote address. Which would you like to begin?
I just want to say thank you. I really enjoyed that and profited from it. Especially, I think I want to pick up on, in my very brief comments, a couple of the passages that you quote. One having to do with that passage about the explosive materials in the heads of laborers, and the peculiar sort of fire that's in the minds of laborers. This strikes me as a really important part of Lincoln's use of language. I think if you read the great speeches, I think maybe one of the things that is most powerfully present in them is a kind of as a sonority and a dignity and a kind of a resonance, a sense of something enduring. When he talks about the Civil War being a test of whether a nation so conceived can long endure, the language is supposed, even though he disavows that anybody's going to remember these words, the language is set up to endure in that way by virtue of its musical qualities, what Gary Wills calls the moral music of the prose. But I think it's also important to think about the part of Lincoln's writing that is sort of like runs across purposes to that, but is equally necessary and equally central to making him the kind of writer he was, which is the explosive element in it, the sense of almost of danger, the sense of risk, of this newness being brought to the world. And in other words, that part of what necessitates or what makes him turn to the examples of rhythmic lyric language that he's imbibed from Shakespeare and other kinds of sources is a sense that he has to take these materials, these explosive materials, and give them a form that gives people a sense that this change is something that can endure. How do you tell people that change can endure? This is the occasion that Lincoln found himself in again and again. After the publication of the draft version of the Emancipation Proclamation, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, this is in November 1862, "In so many arid forms which states encrust themselves with, once in a century, if so often, a poetic act and record occur. These are the jets of thoughts into affairs. When roused by danger or inspired by genius, the political leaders of the day break the else insurmountable routine of class and local legislation and take a step forward in the direction of Catholic and universal interests." And so what Emerson is calling poetic here, the poetic act and record, is the jet of thought. It's the roused by danger. It's inspired by genius. Poesis is creation. Poesis is making something. And so what's poetic about the Emancipation Proclamation for Emerson is that it's bringing this newness into the world. Emerson had written in circles a few decades before, "Power ceases in the moment of repose. It exists in the shooting of the gulf, the darting to an aim." And this is, when we think about the power of Lincoln's language, it has this power to stir. Where does the power come from? I think one of the things I've just, in a supplementary kind of way, contribute to what you've already said, is that it comes from that clarity, the plainness, directness that you emphasize, the cadence in the prose poetry, but also this kind of like X factor, this thing that's very difficult to sort of put your finger on. And just very briefly, one example I've always been struck by of just a kind of like unpredictability in Lincoln's language. In the Gettysburg Address, when he says, "It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us." There's this weird thing that happens where in the first case he says, "It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here." And in the next sentence he says, "It is rather for us to be here dedicated." Like, why bother doing that? What's the big deal about saying to be dedicated here as opposed to saying to be here dedicated? But if you listen to this is going back to the music of the language, the cadence of it, what Lincoln is trying to do is to, and I don't know if it's even a matter of trying, but just he's musical in his language. And so here's the rightness of saying, "It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work." Dedicated here, unfinished work. And then the next time, "It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us." He says it twice for emphasis. But the next time it appears, it's like it's syncopated differently. It's like it's in a different key signature. Something's happened to the music of the language. We're still in the realm of balance. We're still in the realm of order and endurance. But there's a darting, a kind of like movement, just a flipping of the word here from one place to another that I think is one of the sources of this power. That's where I'll end.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Jeff Sanborn is a world-renowned scholar and other things, so we thank him for being here today. Our next responder will be Mark Lytle, and he's going to give another brief response.
My friend Dick, who is here, knows that once when somebody asked what I added to our local school board meetings, they said about 15 minutes. I particularly appreciate what Douglas did here today as somebody whose recent experience was to have the chutzpah to try to take on one of the great prose stylists of the 20th century, Rachel Carson, and try to explain what made her a great writer. I can appreciate how intimidating it is when one's own literary and verbal skills are dwarfed by their subject, and I marvel at how well you did, Douglas. So I really can't improve on what he said. As a historian of the 20th century, however, I was sort of struck that in a culture in which we think about, progress is our most important product, and live in a world of sound bites. If there truly is progress, then how did we get from Lincoln to George W. Bush? I mean, Lincoln obviously was misunderestimated in his own times, and possibly, like Lincoln, when we get to George Bush's state papers, we'll discover perhaps there was a Lincoln buried in there somewhere. But one is dubious, to say the least. And I was recently, I was asked to read a manuscript that is now out as a book on the sort of mental life and public philosophy of Theodore Roosevelt. And one of the things I was struck when I read it was, my God, yes, if you were challenged to think, what other presidents could you actually write a book about their thinking? And I thought, well, of course, Lincoln you could, and Jefferson, although mostly with Jefferson, it was the pre-presidential Jefferson, the author of the Declaration, and Jefferson, the natural philosopher, not so much Jefferson, the president. And I was thinking also, as we heard these many phrases that resonate in our consciousness, the way in which Lincoln framed so many ideas that have endured as part of our historical understanding and public rhetoric, think how rare that is to some degree in the 20th century. I mean, if we remember maybe Teddy Roosevelt describing the presidency as a bully pulpit, and his notion of walking softly and carrying a big stick, or Woodrow Wilson, who was occasionally quite elegant, and perhaps someone about whom a book of ideas actually might be somewhat appropriate. His notion as he called the nation to war and said, God helping her, she can do no other. A nice turn of phrase. But then we got Calvin Coolidge, who said at one time, in his very Coolidgean fashion, the man who builds a factory builds a temple, the man who works there worships there. Very memorable. And 76 years ago yesterday, Franklin Roosevelt did utter a phrase, and I think Franklin Roosevelt, we can at least credit that he very directly and self-consciously involved himself in his own speeches, that he didn't write them in the way Lincoln wrote his, but he at least took responsibility for them and edited them very heavily. And it was, as I said, 76 years ago that he warned us that we have nothing to fear but fear itself, probably one of the most memorable phrases, and that's a later phrase of referring to Pearl Harbor as a day that will live in infamy. These ring in our consciousness. But then I thought about Dwight Eisenhower, who actually, this is one of the things that most people don't know about Eisenhower, was actually a wordsmith. He was once very irritated when somebody compared him pejoratively to Douglas MacArthur. He said, well, who do you think who wrote most of those MacArthur speeches? It was Eisenhower. But Eisenhower, as a public figure, there was one point when he was heading out for a news conference. And one of the things I love about this audience, this is a reference I can make, and this is one of the few audiences I speak to who will actually know what I'm talking about. Because Jim Haggerty, his press secretary, said to him, he said, Mr. President, he said, I'm not sure you're really prepared. They're liable to ask you some tough questions. He said, Jim, don't worry about it. I'll just go out there and confuse them. And of course, then there was Kennedy, and Kennedy was also, who called us to pay any price and bear any burden, who did leave us with a number of memorable phrases for whom we have Theodore Sorensen to thank, that Kennedy knew a good speech when he read it, but he was not responsible. And really, since then, I mean, I suppose, my political prejudices prevent me from extolling Ronald Reagan and Grady. I mean, he left some memorable phrases like the evil empire and whatnot, although one of the things I discovered is his evil empire speech, which he gave to to the House of, Parliament in Britain, House of Commons, he never used the phrase evil empire, used it months later in a speech he gave to Florida evangelicals. But there hasn't really been a president who is a significant wordsmith, and maybe we can blame it on television or we can blame it on our contemporary political culture. But I think it's really quite extraordinary when we revisit Lincoln. And I think one of the things I'm also reminded of when, at a conference like this is, Lincoln, everybody knows Lincoln, but nobody knows Lincoln. I mean, he remains, I think no subject in American history has been more written about than Lincoln. When I was in graduate school, one of my professors, we were talking about, somebody was saying, well, why would I want to do that dissertation? There have been lots of books on it. He said, listen, there are 900, 1,000 books on Lincoln, and there are more coming out all the time. And this was in 1970. There are probably, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 Lincoln books out there now, and somehow or other he still eludes us. And so I think that's the real joy of hearing a paper like this, is that it brings Lincoln alive to us, because obviously he sort of invented his public self in his language. Thank you.
Jim, would you like to come up and join the table? You can sit in that way you won't have to have your back to the audience if you'd like to. Come on up, there's a fourth seat there, and I'll stand. We have a half an hour now before our next break, and that half hour is dedicated to you and to your questions and comments. And if you'd like to address them to anyone in particular, you could do that, or we'll try, a number of us will try to respond. So I'm sure you have some questions. Yes, you can begin. Go ahead. Do we have a microphone on the floor still? If there is one, it'll be coming. But in the meantime, you could speak up.
It was mentioned earlier the influence
Here we go.
of the American writers of the 1850s on Lincoln as
Thank you again.
Thank you. Earlier it was mentioned the influence of the American writers of the 1850s on Lincoln as a writer and a thinker. And it's a little easier to trace, I think, Thoreau and Douglas through Lincoln because of their philosophical and political content. But I was wondering if anyone could speak more, if briefly, on the influence of Hawthorne and Melville on Lincoln as a writer and a thinker and a developing political figure.
I didn't mean to imply that because Melville and Hawthorne. I didn't mean to imply in my remarks that Melville and Hawthorne and were having an influence on Lincoln. I simply meant that it was a time. I mean, they were, of course, some of them were more aware of each other, but there was some kind of something happening in the culture, and they were responding to it, which is what good writers are supposed to do, and that Lincoln, too, was responding in his own way. But no, I don't think that he was reading Melville, unfortunately. He and Melville would have lots to talk about because they had similar interests, but I don't think they ever did more than just shake hands.
Jeff?
Yeah, they shook hands once, but that was nice. very small influence. But in terms of influences, one of the things that's interesting about Lincoln is that he read, in addition to Shakespeare, a lot of writers who are pretty uncool right now. Shakespeare and Burns are the ones that are that are more respectable. But he really liked certain kinds of kind of sentimental poems about moral heroism he admired, and others of that ilk. And he was drawn to a kind of poetry, to really melancholy lyric poetry that stressed the insignificance of human beings in relation to fate. And so he's drawn to a certain content, I would say, almost more than anything else, and a kind of rhythmic kind of sonority and kind of sense of the potential endurance in it. But he thought about himself as someone who's trying stylistically to make the style almost become transparent to the thought, and his literary influences, were not of the kind that we might like to imagine that they were.
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah. Yes, in the red.
I know there's a new book out. There's a new book out on Darwin and Lincoln, and I was wondering if someone spoke about the difficulty of conveying the notion that change can be permanent, and I wondered if any of you had a comment on the influence of the Darwinian paradigm or use of metaphor in Lincoln's writings.
Anybody want to take that on?
I'll just say one
Doug.
thing briefly. Herndon is very emphatic that Lincoln not only read once but twice, which is very unusual for him to read a book of this kind twice, but a book that was written in the 1840s, which was talking about the tendency of modern science, thinking about geology and astronomy, and developing models that were suggesting simple to complex development, that the world is not a stasis, that there is development going on. This is a popular writer, but a very smart one, and he's picking up on the currents of the science. Well, certainly Lyell and Wallace and Wallace and Darwin are creating this sort of wind that he's responding to, and I think it's also true that Lincoln knew something about the Origin of Species when it was published, and whether he read it or not, but he was responsive to that kind of thing. That and according to Herndon, he was hungry for it. So.
Doug, didn't Herndon write that Lincoln actually was aware of Darwin's book, Origin of Species, and had
Yes.
read it, or
Yes, well,
read
it's
in
not
it?
clear that he read it, but he knew about it.
Yeah.
And everybody
and he was
talking
excited about it. He was excited about it in
Yes,
general.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Darwin, of course, and Lincoln share the exact same day of birth, February 12th, 1809. So their bicentennial is shared. The bicentennial year coincides, and the bicentennial day coincided. Adam Gopnik is the author of a book on Darwin and Lincoln. So, other questions from the floor? Yes, please. I was going to ask that if nobody else did.
What's the question? Is he a reader of the Bible? Oh, God.
Well, we've talked about the influence of Shakespeare and of Burns and of Melville and others, but let's talk about the influence of the Bible. And I'd like Professor Wilson to start with that, if he would.
I would say he knew the Bible extremely well, and he knew it from a very early age. It was certainly the first book he knew anything about, and he probably cut his intellectual literary teeth on it. That was a grotesque figure. Ignore that. So he was imbued with it, and he could outquote anybody so he really knew the Bible very well, and of course you see it all biblical references all the way through his work. Marvelous weaving of them in the second inaugural, if you've studied that speech. But here again, I would think, just as a general observation, I would think it's much like Shakespeare and the other poets. He's rhythmical. He's imbibing rhythms. He's responding to rhythms and cadences, and when we can see, some of them seem biblical and are in origin, but it's never an easy thing to formulate. But certainly in the rhythm, in terms of language, but in terms of rhythms and cadences, I would go the same direction as with the Shakespeare.
I would just,
sorry. Go ahead, Jeff.
Just to
first.
add to that really briefly, that I was thinking when you were talking about the clarity and directness of Lincoln's language, what that's in the service of is the desire to find a common language, a kind of field on which he and his listeners can come into a new kind of relationship, a kind of union. So it's as though every address or every conversation is an occasion for a certain kind of union. And one of the things that Shakespeare provides and the King James Bible provides is it's a common works that he can presume a great many people are familiar with. So, just adding to that, the cadences are extremely important in both cases. But Burns as well. One of the things he loved about Burns is he was a folk poet who seemed to speak from a kind of common collective experience.
And in the back, you had your hand up. Yes, please.
For Professor Wilson, isn't it true that some or a lot of his speeches were put in the newspaper, filtered through the memory and language of the reporter, that may have done injustice to the way he may have expressed some of these things, because in the 19th century it was kind of common practice, I think, that if a reporter thought somebody didn't say something nicely, they spiffed it up a little bit, or the way they thought it should be. And was the Cooper Union speech, or is the Cooper Union speech an example of that?
Well, perhaps in very minor ways. One of the people who was in charge of making a pamphlet out of the Cooper Union speech wrote to Lincoln and said, I want you to read this over. We'd made a few changes, nothing really very important, but I want you to look it over. Lincoln's response is really wonderful, because he shows him, he says, you have changed what I said about Douglas to Democrats. In other words, he was trying to make this not only an attack on Douglas, but an attack on Democrats generally. And Lincoln says, you see, that would be a great blunder, because what I say about Douglas there is true of him, but not generally the Democrats. So, that's a really nuanced judgment that someone else couldn't make, but he's very alive to. And he isn't going to let something like that pass, because that's a distinction that's important to him. So those kinds of examples suggest that when he got a chance to go over a text, if somebody else had been fooling with it, he had his own reaction to that. He begins by saying, oh, sure, yeah, and changes, make it better, good. But then it turns out that he doesn't like any of the changes. And certainly he points out some that he thinks are, as he says, blunders.
Doug, could you comment on the campaign biography that he had a chance to edit? Well, very revealing, I believe.
Yes, it is revealing, but there was a campaign biographer written by William Dean Howells, who was a very young man. I think that was his first book. And he wrote it from notes that were taken by a reporter who was sent from Columbus, where he was. And so he was getting filtered information. And somebody had the idea of when it came out, getting Lincoln to go over it and correct it. And then since that, he did that marginally, and since that time we've had that to use, because it's been reprinted in facsimile. The problem is that people carry that too far. When he says that he was an Adams man. That's how he got. He was Lincoln crosses that out and puts anti-Jackson. Now that's very useful to know. But people have taken to saying, well, it says here so and so. This must be right because he didn't change it. No. By that rule, you authorize all kinds of things that we can prove beyond reasonable doubt are errors. He just didn't bother with them. And most of his corrections are in that he didn't go all the way through it. So I would just throw up that caveat about that.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Sir,
Can I ask a question?
one question. This is James Oakes. You haven't met him yet, some of you, but he'll be our third speaker today.
It follows from the previous question, and it's always struck me about Lincoln's writing. He strives for clarity. He strives to make himself understood, but I think there's a difference between writing written for public speaking and writing written to be read. And the paradox for me shows up in the difficulty I often have reading some of the speeches. They don't read easily. The sentences are long and they are convoluted, and it takes a long time to get the rhythm. It doesn't come automatically. The Springfield Farewell, for example, I had to read that a half a dozen times before I could get the rhythm in my mind. And I always have this problem when I read the climactic passage from the second inaugural address. It's a very long and a very complicatedly framed passage. And I wondered if you'd comment on that paradox. Is it just me, or is there a genuine paradox there between what I think is correct, the simplicity and clarity of his prose and the complexity of many of his sentences?
Well, maybe Jeff Sanborn will help me out here. Let me just say that there isn't any doubt in my mind that the way he read his speeches is probably at variance with the way we would read them and pronounce them. We have some copy there from his own manuscript where he has underlined the things, and he puts emphasis on words that you would never think to emphasize. And trying to follow his emphasis, you can really stumble. I'm thinking of the House Divided speech. So I urge people not to read that, because that's marked up for his delivery as opposed to reading. So I would say, but yet, it's probably more complicated than that. It's probably that he hears things and renders things in a way that he's hearing something that we're not hearing, that we'll never hear unless we hear him read. Apparently, authoritatively, it's reported that William Butler Yeats, one of the great poets of the 20th century, and incredible subtle rhythms in his use of words, especially the great poems, and it's reported that he had this kind of, if he read the things, it was this kind of routinized way, and that he even pronounced words in such a way that you realize that he's putting the beat over here. So it may be that the poet has his own ear, his own way of reading it, and that what we get is also very, very good, but it isn't quite the same as the poets.
Mm-hmm. Good answer. Now this man here without the jacket on.
Thank you. Taking Yeats first, before I go to my other question, I believe when he read it as follows: I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree. He was asked why he read so peculiarly. He answered, I took a great deal of trouble to put it into verse, and I'll be damned if I read it as prose.
That's great.
So shifting to another great poet, and returning to the spirit of the original question about the great writers who emerged in the 1850s, I've read that Lincoln, when Leaves of Grass first came out, loved to read long passages of it to his fellows in the law office. And I was touched that you were able to make one of his Lincoln sentences sound like it was from Leaves of Grass. Would any of you care to say more about that influence? What exactly is known of his reading of Whitman, and other ways we could trace the influence?
There are two reasons that persuade people that Lincoln did read Leaves of Grass, and there's no doubt that his law partner, who was a great book collector and a wide reader, he had that book in his library. He never says anything about Whitman, Herndon talks about almost everything. So that's one thing. But people who are persuaded by the testimony of a guy who claims he was a clerk in the law office, except that there's great reason to doubt that he ever was. And he claims that, and there are problems with his story, he gets some of the geography wrong. So there's good reason to doubt his testimony. And then the Milwaukee Address has this incredible Whitmanian catalog. And I grant you, it sounds very much like Whitman. It sounds Whitman-esque. And to my mind, that would be the strongest evidence, because I think the other is not very good evidence. But it's inconclusive. I'm afraid to put that down as a premise and move on from there. I just don't have enough confidence in it.
Yeah, I would agree that the catalog too. You can think about like Emerson's the meal and the firkin, the milk and the pan, and the kind of like recitation of homely details in I think that's from The Poet or somewhere or other. That doesn't necessarily indicate a familiarity with Whitman. And Whitman also, as we sort of like read is in the morning session, people were pointing out, we read Lincoln through the kind of like magnifying lens of his assassination and the sort of like subsequent sense of him as a great president. We do the same with Whitman, and Whitman didn't become the good great poet until the 1870s really, and so it was he would have. I think Lincoln would have to have been a different kind of reader of literature to have been familiar with Whitman.
I know I'm going to ask a question now before the next one from the audience. I'm particularly impressed with Lincoln and his leadership in terms of his exquisite sense of timing, waiting for the right moment in which to say something or to release something in writing. This seems to be part of the secret of his great leadership skill. The expression "a word fitly spoken" that you quoted from, the fitliness, it has to do with the timing. The timing of that word. A word spoken one day could have little effect, and spoken at the right moment could have tremendous effect. Perhaps, Douglas, you could speak about the power of words to influence the unfolding of events, and that sensitivity to timing that Lincoln seemed to have had.
There's no doubt that he had it, and I think the one that I think the decision, the weighty decision that the timing is so important, is the Emancipation Proclamation. So it isn't so much concerned with exquisite language, although the writing of the Declaration or of the Emancipation Proclamation is a special kind of writing, and he did it brilliantly. It had to be non-emotional. It had to avoid landmines. So he made it just as dry and legalistic as he possibly could. And if you want to see what the difference between himself and Simon P. Chase, who thought it ought to be a document saying, "This is a great humanitarian thing we are about to do," he drafted such a speech for Lincoln. You'll find it in the Lincoln Papers. But Lincoln knew that was the wrong thing to do. And I think he's right. I think he would agree now that that was the right thing to do. But how soon to do it? It had to be, he had all these constituencies who had big trouble with putting blacks in the Army. And this is what he really was looking toward. And he doesn't even talk about that in the preliminary. And it almost comes in as an afterthought in the final Emancipation Proclamation. The word gets out, he puts the word out, I'm talking about for military necessity, freeing the slaves where they're in places where there's a rebellion against the country, the federal authority is resisted. And he doesn't say he's going to authorize the use of the black troops, which had not been done, except in the Navy. So the question is, in his mind, as he says, he says to his cabinet when he writes the one in September, 100 days before, so-called preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, I don't know if the country is ready for this, but we'll have to see. And they say to him, well, of course, it's going to cost us the election this fall. And he says, yes. And of course, things just are a disaster on the battlefield, in the cabinet, in the Congress. It's just a total nightmare for him. And yet, and then there was speculation that he wouldn't go through with it because things were so bad. But he goes through with it. He signs it. And that's what they're waiting in Boston to hear, Frederick Douglass and his friends. Will he do it? Will he really sign it? He said he would, but did he do it? And so forth. But he does it, and he gets away with it, so that the Army doesn't object, the officer corps doesn't object, the enlisted men, as long as they're separate, they're willing to accept it. They don't want them to get the same pay, so they don't get the same pay. They don't want them to wear the same uniform, but Stanton and Lincoln insist that they wear the same uniform. It's a negotiation, but eventually it works, and a couple of months later, Lincoln is in a conversation with a visitor, and I mean, nobody but Lincoln would say this. If Chase were president, he'd say, well, I had that figured exactly right. You know, I had the timing. Lincoln says, I didn't know whether the country was going to accept it or not. So he took a risk, and I think that he is a risk taker, and he is, you can see him in a number of places, and it is timing, but it's a guess.
It's a guess.
He doesn't know something that everybody else doesn't know.
But he does know to resist speaking too early.
Yes.
He knows how to withhold his word.
Yeah.
And then to release it when he thinks it's going to be most effective. He doesn't know for sure because he's in the middle of history. But
right. That's my sense of it. Yes.
Yeah.
It also has to do with, I think, that sense of humility in the face of a vast universe and an inscrutable God and especially in the second inaugural address. I mean, one of the remarkable things about it is, I mean, that phrase about it was the right occasion at the first inaugural address for me to say this. It was fitting and proper then, but now the different words are called forth at this point. What he talks about is occasions calling forth language. So what he's saying is that I'm not speaking here. The occasion is speaking here. And what is the occasion speaking of? It's speaking of the war, and it's speaking of God. And you get the sense, instead of, I'm talking to you, in the first person pronoun, the second person pronoun, you get the sense that the occasion of an inaugural address in a time of war is speaking to the American people as a whole, and I think that's another way of thinking about that emphasis on fitness, and maybe about the influence of Shakespeare too. That the kind of negative capability of Shakespeare that everybody admired so much in the 19th century. It's as though a president takes that kind of that negative capability. He says, "Well, I am not speaking. The office is speaking. The presidency is now speaking at this moment."
And you have to have a certain humility, of respect for that office, respect for that occasion, and you become almost a servant of that. You allow yourself, in a sense, to be used, or you apply your intelligence to the context.
And you can think about that as a rhetorical trick, but it seems really deeply felt to me in Lincoln.
There's another example that's going to come up in my talk later on this afternoon, but in the first meeting he has with Frederick Douglass, one of the complaints Douglass goes to Lincoln to talk to about is that he took too long to issue an order of retaliation. It was a timing issue because by the time he got to Washington, the order had been issued. And he says to Lincoln, it took you a little time. And what Lincoln says is, the country needed talking up to. On that point, right? So it was a timing issue directly related to the talking issue, to the language issue. So I think they are very closely connected.
And this is related to the issue of leadership.
Yeah.
What is the job of a leader?
Right.
It's in part, a leader doesn't have a military power to just declare things done.
Right.
The American president needs to bring people along with him. It's the power of persuasion. It's the power of... And a leader has to be out ahead of the people to some extent to bring them somewhere, but he can't be, or she can't be too far out ahead, or they're not going to have the body politic along with them. Stuart Levine. Oh, yes. Here we go. Use the microphone, Stuart. Here is the microphone. Our friend.
In John Law's book a year or so ago, he calls Lincoln a towering figure. And I wonder if you might comment on that aspect of a man, of being towering, And what I would ask you about is the fact that when he leaves Springfield, he gives a few remarks to his friends and neighbors to bid them an affectionate farewell. And it's chilling. It is a chilling statement. In 4 years later, or more than 4 years later, he's a tired man, having faced a world covered with the blood of his countrymen. And he remains in the second inaugural, still towering and chilling. And I wonder if you could comment on what you believe about him as an individual to be able to do that, and these bookends, in a way, of what he has to say at the beginning, going to Washington, and 4 years later, the same kind of towering remarks.
Stuart, thank you. This will be our last question before our break. But any of you, please feel free, maybe starting with Douglas, to answer that.
I would say that I regard Lincoln as a towering figure, and I think many people do. I don't know whether it's right to say most people.
Could you speak closer to the microphone, please?
Yes. I certainly regard him as, but I consider that part of the perspective of seeing him in a historical distance, because so many people in his own time didn't see him in that way. It is proved to be, and it's like the farewell address of people, his neighbor, it was to his neighbors, and they were moved by that address, and they wept, and it was a very moving occasion, but they didn't think of him as a towering man. They thought of him as a neighbor. They admired him. They thought he was a good man, a talented man, good lawyer, good speaker, and so forth. But the business about towering, I think, comes with historical perspective. And that's what I meant this morning when I said that Lincoln became a hero when he got shot. He was not a hero before that, and if he'd had to go through the bloody wars of Reconstruction, he might have come out looking very different and feeling very different to the country. But so that's what I would say about towering. The farewell address, the thing that I think is so remarkable is that he gave this extemporaneous, he told the reporters, I'm not going to speak. He gets on the train, they're all in the car, he comes back out. It's spontaneous. He takes his hat off. Everybody in the crowd takes their hat off. He gives this speech. We don't know exactly what he said. We have a number of accounts from it. He goes back in and they said, you said you weren't going to speak, so we don't have any notes. Please write out what you said. So then what we now use is what he wrote out. And of course there, I try to show in my book, if you try to see what he said from the evidence of the various accounts, substantially it's the same, but the difference in the way in which he's condensed it, the way in which he's rearranged the elements, is just a brilliant revision, so that he knew the difference between speaking and having the audience, having the right effect, and that this wouldn't do for a newspaper. I have to rewrite this, and so we get his talent. He's like a double-barreled shotgun. He can do it extemporaneously, or he can write it out.
I think that's a good place